Before analyzing the first act of Macbeth, I would like to mention two concepts that are important in understanding Shakespeare's view of tragedy, especially in relations to his plays about kings and queens and the relationship between kings and queens and their subjects. The first important concept to understand is the idea of the great chain of being. This was a medieval and early modern period concept to help justify the idea of a divine right monarchy. According to this theory of government, the king receives all of his power from God. There is essentially a vertical line which establishes this relationship. At the very top is God. God chooses his ministers on earth. They are the kings, and for secular matters, and for the Catholic Church, the Pope, for spiritual matters. One of the problems that would happen for this theory, of course, is what happens when there's a revolution. What happens when a king is killed? The king, under this theory, is chosen by God, and kings were raised and taught and believed that they had absolute authority on earth because they were empowered by God to carry the scepter on earth. So anytime there's a revolution or a king is murdered in a conspiracy, this threatens this great chain of being and the rightful place of the king. So murdering a king, the crime which Macbeth commits, is particularly heinous. And whereas Shakespeare would spend his first two tetralogies, his first 8 history plays, trying to justify the overthrow of Richard II and the eventual rise of the Tudors, Shakespeare must similarly deal with this great chain of being question. And he does this by, just like he does in Richard III, where he displays Richard III as a thoroughly awful, almost satanic, evil being. He shows that Macbeth is not only not a rightful king, but a terrible criminal. And for these reasons, it is right to overthrow him in order to gain justice for the crime that he has committed. Another important aspect to understand about Shakespeare's tragedies is the concept of the Wheel of Fortune. This concept is very prominent in tragedies throughout this period and during the medieval times as well. The Wheel of Fortune simply states that one day you may be on top of the world, but the next day you may be at the bottom, and that this is the nature of corporeal human existence in the real world before we die and eventually go to heaven. And this idea of the great chain of being and the Wheel of Fortune is important because at one time Duncan is at the top, but then he is overthrown. Then Macbeth is at the top, and then he is overthrown. Shakespeare's tragedies explore this concept of the Wheel of Fortune and the way that our fates change and why they change, and how this is both a result of inevitability, a result of fate, as well as the result of personal choices and decisions that we make. So looking at these two themes, I'd like to begin talking about the first act. So in the first act of the play, we see Macbeth at the very top of the Wheel of Fortune. He has just put down the rebellion of the Irish and the King of Norway. He is a victorious warrior, and throughout the play, his skill as a warrior is constantly stressed. It is quite clear that Macbeth is a violent man, he is a warrior, and he is one of the greatest soldiers in Scotland of the day. However, his love of violence and his ability to achieve his aims through violence do not reflect well on his ability to become a king, because he does not have the wisdom or the patience to make the proper judgments that he would need as a king. And we see this throughout the play. His only resort to any kind of threat to his status or station is through violence. Macbeth is a violent man, and because of this, he is unable to consolidate his reign as king. So right from the beginning of the play, we see Banquo and Macbeth returning victoriously from the field of battle. where they are confronted by the three witches who give them the prophecy that Macbeth will be king, and but he will have no heirs, and that Banquo will not be king, but his children will themselves be kings. This immediately awakens ambition in Macbeth. Banquo, however, shows that he is a more thoughtful person. In a famous conversation piece, Banquo says, after the prophecy is given, that trusted home might e'en kindle you unto the crown, besides the Thane of Cawdor. But 'tis strange, and oftentimes, to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths. Win us with honest trifles. To betrays in deepest consequence, cousins, a word I pray you. Banquo recognizes that the council of evil figures, of satanic figures, can only lead to violence and to destruction. And he seems wary and cautious of what the witches have to say. However, the witches' prophecies awaken the sense of ambition into Macbeth. And this sense of ambition is going to be what drives him to his downfall. According to the Great Chain of Being idea, Macbeth is a thane. He is a servant of his king, and his rightful station and duty in life is to support his king, Duncan. Therefore, a common theme in tragedies, not only Shakespeare but other tragedies, is the fall of a great man through overreaching, to trying to be something he is not, to try to attain to a station to which he is undeserving. This is extremely common in the tragic cycle because tragedies generally begin at the top of the Wheel of Fortune, where a person has achieved the highest station in his or her life, and then they will fall. And tragedies, as a genre, generally seek to explain and justify these falls from the very pinnacle of life to the bottom, to the most desperate, to the desperate times, and to death. Another important theme to understand in Macbeth, I mentioned earlier, is the role of feminism and the role of women and the role of masculinity. This question becomes particularly important in Macbeth because the most memorable character in the play is not really Macbeth. Most critical literature, or a lot of critical literature, focuses on the role of Lady Macbeth for many reasons. When Lady Macbeth hears about the prophecy, she is immediately elated, and she wishes to push her husband to become king. Lady Macbeth is extremely ambitious, and she doesn't betray a conscience until the very end of the play, where she is driven mad. Throughout the play, Macbeth is going to question some of the murders that he must commit. He's going to stop and think about the duties and obligations he owes to Duncan, as well as to the various other people that he must murder. But Lady Macbeth is constantly pushing him to commit these crimes. Lady Macbeth is a demonic figure, in my opinion. And we see this in literature, in Shakespeare, and almost any other work of literature you can find, where a female takes on a dominant role and where a female becomes ambitious. Ambition is something that's associated with men. The projects of ruling, the projects of taking initiative, of being in charge, of running a state, of planning policy. These things have traditionally been associated with men. Even today, if you look at politics, you see what happens when a woman tries to run for high office or a woman comes into power. She's oftentimes castigated as unnatural, as something demonic, as something evil, as if she is usurping the rightful place of a man. I could talk more about this, having witnessed the election of Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, and some of the things that were said about Hillary Clinton. But there's always been a traditional bias against ambitious women. They are seen as, again, something demonic, something monstrous, something not female. And Lady Macbeth voices this explicitly. She says, Um, she calls on the gods to unsex her at one point, saying that she cannot be a woman if she is going to be ambitious. She must be not even a man. She must become a monster. And throughout the play, Lady Macbeth is successful at persuading Macbeth to commit so many crimes by questioning his masculinity. And this is important. One of the key themes of the play for me is this idea of what is a man. At one point, before Macbeth is going to kill Duncan, Macbeth is questioning whether he should do this. And Lady Macbeth says, "What beast was it then that made you break this enterprise to me? When you durst do it, then you were a man. When you kill him, you will become a man. And to be more than what you were, you would be so much more than man." So she's even hinting there, be more than man. He must do this. "Nor time nor place did then adhere, and yet you would make both. Then have made themselves, and that their fitness now does unmake you. I have given suck, and know how tender 'tis to love the babe that milks me. I would, while it was smiling in my face, have plucked my nipple from his boneless gums and dashed the brains out, had I sworn as you have done to this." So we can see this demonic character. She's pushing and pushing Macbeth, saying that you are not a man unless you are willing to commit murder. What kind of man are you? You must be a coward. She shows that she is disrespectful of her station as a woman, saying that she would kill her own babes had she spoken as cowardly as Macbeth. And throughout the play, this becomes an important theme, is that Macbeth, through his misunderstanding of masculinity, his misunderstanding of duty, his misunderstanding of honor, continues to commit violence. And he comes to believe, with the pushing of Lady Macbeth, that in order to demonstrate his masculinity, he must be a violent man. And this violence in man, which is cruel, and Lady Macbeth is something demonic and unnatural. And later on in the play, when Macbeth has Macduff's children killed, we will see how Macduff shows his masculinity and how he creates an alternative model which is not based solely on violence, but also on feeling as well.